like common sense. But to somebody who's never come in, they might be a genius in their world, but they don't know anything about podcasting. They might not understand the consequences of those things while recording. So
in the end, you can kind of rely on the fact that it's okay to just try things, make things, break things, along the way. And that's okay. That's kind of part of the process. It's
what kind of tech do you need? And if you don't know what kind of tech you need, there's a billion blogs out there. There's a lot of YouTube videos that teach you what to do. Welcome back to the Challngtunity Podcast. I'm Chris Lawson, your host. Hopefully you're having yourself an amazing summer thus far. I know for us, we're already on episode 14, and it has been quite the adventure. Today we're going to be tackling some pretty important topics, but before we dive into that, I'd like to introduce you to my co-host, Jordan Woolf, who was once quoted, "Sting like a bee, but do not float like a butterfly. That's ridiculous."
It's almost insulting at this point, but that's fine. That's fine.
To who, the butterfly or the bee?
Just the whole bastardization of the quote, but that's fine. That's fine.
Oh, it is ridiculous. Well, Jordan, what do we have on the docket today? What are we talking about in the Challngtunity Podcast?
We're talking about this crazy thing that we're doing right now, which is podcasting. The ups and downs, the ins and outs, why we're doing this, how we ended up here, what process we went through. I think it's spurred on by a couple things. Just, it's a weird thing to do. Not everybody does this. So, giving a little bit of window inside that world, I think is worthwhile, especially we're, insiders now, I guess, sort of stumbling through it, but we were outsiders not that long ago, trying to figure this out ourselves, as well as getting a sense of what that looks like. What does it entail? How easy is it? How hard is it? All these types of things we'll probably cover today.
Yeah, I mean, we're technically more than episode 14. What a lot of viewers don't know, actually a lot of people around us don't know, is that, we had the pilot that counted as an additional one, and we've actually had some episodes that were recorded that we canceled for different reasons, just things in the world or whatever. And so we've actually got more than the 14 episodes, but there's a lot that we know now that we had no idea about when we came into it. So we want to talk a bit about that today, as well as from our, I don't know, we're not novice anymore. Where are we? What's above novice? Intermediate?
Amateur, I guess.
Amateur? Yeah. I don't know. We're a step above novice now, or maybe a little bit above the amateur level. And so we want to provide some tips, some things that we found. If someone was to tell us when we first started, it would have been pretty handy. So, Jordan, why don't we just jump into it? It's going to be less of a technical conversation today. I think it'll be one that's a little bit more practical.
Let's tell a story. Let's go way back to before we had the bright idea to get into this vlogging and podcasting world.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Young Jordan, who didn't know how to do anything in a podcast world, what was something that you didn't know then that you know now that you wish you were able to tell young Jordan?
Well, I mean, there's two parts. There's the phase of before podcasting where I had not researched it at all. And then there's the part before podcasting where I'd at least done some homework. I'd say before, I was just a fan. You are in the digital world these days. You spend any time on YouTube, or you listen to iTunes, whatever your podcatcher of choice is. You're listening to podcasts these days. It's part of your day-to-day life. Maybe it's while you're exercising or while you're out there, walking the dog. And those types of things have been part of my life for a little while now, many years. I'm a kind of avid listener, at least when I'm walking around. I will catch certain ones on YouTube, or the ones I just listen to, and it really depends on the podcast, which is kind of interesting in itself. But that lifestyle was something that obviously I've been quite exposed to. Something now as a agency owner, it was only an inevitable kind of point in the future where you'd combine those two ideas and go like, hey, we should be podcasting too, and also leverage this medium that everyone's spending time on day in, day out.
I think it was more that everybody was asking us to do the podcast. I don't think we really wanted to do a podcast.
No, especially not myself. I'm not somebody who likes to be in front of cameras or up on stages and things like that. And it's not because I'm shy. I can do this comfortably. It's just I prefer to operate from the shadows, like lurking in the corners in the darkness. So it's where I'm most comfortable. So doing this was not my first intention, when I got into this business or running an agency or doing even marketing efforts. But when you do the math on it, it kind of makes sense. It's something that allows you to communicate a lot of ideas really quickly in a medium that's very approachable and across and distributable across a whole bunch of different mediums and sizes and shapes and ways of slicing and dicing this.
Right. So what would you say is something that you didn't know then that you know now?
Well, like I said, there was those two steps. So before I started educating myself on like, okay, we're going to do this, and we're start doing some homework and, like technologies and tools and processes to follow. I think I always knew that it would take some work. You hear these things if you listen to enough podcasts, like a lot of them hire people to like manage the whole thing behind the scenes if they get to a certain point in scale.
There's agencies that do that. That's a business model.
Exactly. I mean, whether you're producing a podcast that gives you about one person or 1 million people, the same amount of work has to go into it, unfortunately. So the fact that they're, hiring whole teams of people or agencies to do that, sometimes full-time individuals, sometimes teams or agencies, it shows that there's a lot of work behind the scenes that go into this thing that seems, until you realize that quite a bit of a like throwaway thing, like, oh, they just sit in front of a camera and yap. But it's not quite that way in practice. So that's something I knew-ish, but didn't quite really know in my core yet.
I mean, and just piggybacking on that, we did a lot of research on, how we're going to do the distribution of the podcast, what kind of software we're going to use to record and host, what kind of tech do you need? And if you don't know what kind of tech you need, there's a billion blogs out there. There's a lot of YouTube videos that teach you what to do. But, I come from an audiovisual background. I'm a musician. So I kind of know a lot about microphones and, gain levels and doing all that kind of stuff, cameras. But like, how do we get all this out to the world? And at what point do you really promote it? And how do you do so? Some of that we knew coming from the agency world, but there's a whole bunch of question marks that we had. So we had to do a lot of homework. I think the thing for me, this would be maybe the second point, is I didn't know how much work this was going to be. Like you when you come into it that you got to do a recording, you assume that it's going to take, X amount of time to do a recording and that you're going to have to do some prep, right? You're going to have to prepare a list of things to talk about and things like that. You're going to have some post editing, things like that, some distribution. But it was things like prepping your guests. A guest is coming on, they may not have watched the podcast before. They might not know what to expect. Are they going to go and spend 3 hours of watching a whole bunch of your episodes? Probably not. So creating checklists for them and modifying that checklist as you realize different things, like they don't have, sufficient audio or mics or whatever, just adding these things in, making sure that people isolate themselves. And so they don't have pets and cats or I guess that's a, pet, but, family members or whatever, or not in a cafe where it's loud, like all these different things, these assets that we had to develop to actually make the podcast take off, let alone the revisions, the editing, finding audio files and dealing with graphics people for your intros and all that kind of stuff. There was way more than I expected day one.
I think what, now that we've scared everybody into this is a lot of work, never do
Don't
this.
start a
We've
podcast.
made a horrible mistake. Yeah. It is something that once you kind of dip your toe into it, it kind of also just happens. So you go through those pages, you find out that next thing that you need to develop, and you just develop, you just do the work. So it is something that's achievable, but it is hard to anticipate up front all the little pieces. You kind of just stumble into them and go like, oh yeah, I never even thought about that. I guess we're gonna have to do this now, or build that tool, or buy this, software. In our case, it's been something that we've, fortunately had at least a toe in something. Like you said, you had that audio background. I've always been somewhat inclined to technology, and of course we're both in marketing. So we had some exposure to some of the things ahead of time. So maybe we've got a bit of an advantage there, but in the end, you can kind of rely on the fact that it's okay to just try things, make things, break things, along the way. And that's okay. That's kind of part of the process. It's not as chiseled in stone as you think it is. Once it's on, YouTube or in iTunes, that seems like it's the end of the universe. That's all we can do. It has to be perfect. But in reality, get it out there, iterate, make the next episode better and the next episode better, learn the lessons, just continue the process.
I remember the first time that I accidentally triggered an animation that I wasn't supposed to trigger at that exact time, and it was embarrassing, and I laughed, and I almost felt like we had to edit it out, but in hindsight we kept it. Mind you, last episode there was a moment where I got the giggles and I couldn't stop laughing for about half an hour, and we had to cut it. Like no one's going to sit there and listen to Chris giggling for half an hour.
I couldn't even listen to it, so I had to live through it.
I think you walked away. I think you just said, I'm getting a drink. Mm-hmm. I got my giggles out. But you're right. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay. It's a podcast. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're not perfect. Tech's not always perfect. You're almost perfect. And I think there's a level of authenticity that comes with not being so polished and just being yourself and, things like that. Mm-hmm.
I've kind of settled into that. It's the thing that's more comfortable now about this is like, I'm talking to a camera and at the end of the day, I don't know who the individual is that's going to watch this tomorrow, and I may never meet them, and that's fine. If you don't like it, that's okay. You've learned something. There's lots of other podcasts out there, but we're learning things along the way too, and we're trying to make a better episode next time. So maybe you tune in the next one and it's that much better. Maybe it made that difference where now it is your thing. So,
well, and I think too, with making mistakes comes listening to the people that do engage with your podcast. We haven't really pushed and promoted it at the point now, like today on the date that we're recording this. This is going to be, a little bit different. Obviously, we pre-record some of these, but the reality is like a lot of the followership that we do have already and a lot of the listeners and stuff, some of it comes in comments and stuff like that, but a lot of it is like emails. We have a website, followers, some of our followers that we know just in our personal life, they give us feedback, and taking that feedback goes a long way. So make those mistakes, mm-hmm. but also, be open to criticisms and listen to the people that are telling you things that they are engaging with and loving about the podcast, because that might actually be the thing that people come back for in the first place.
Yeah, and as we said at the beginning, like this isn't my cup of tea initially. This wasn't something I was hoping, dreaming to do this year was more podcasting. But now that we've kind of gotten into it, I mean, there are other things that you kind of, other than just learning how to do it, it's the kind of side benefits that do come from it. One thing that I've experienced in the course of episode after episode after episode kind of forces you to talk about things that you maybe were thinking in the back of your head about or kind of ruminated on, but didn't really express or have an outlet to get that idea out there. So having the episodes specialize in different areas allows you to think in an area maybe you hadn't tried before, or get an idea that was locked inside your head, outside of your head, and really discuss it in front of other people. So that's kind of something I've personally found rewarding out of the process as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's different parts of the podcast, right? So like there's parts of what I do every single day that I just now do on a podcast. And anybody who's listened for any period of time, there's analogies that you'll hear from me, and it's like, okay, he said that a billion times. It's clear, it's pretty polished. But there are elements of this podcast, parts of business modeling and stuff that I'm just not a part of because, like, for example, one of our first episodes, we had Matthew from iComply. We're talking about stuff that I know nothing about whatsoever, but you do a little bit of research, you engage in the conversation and stuff. So sometimes, I like getting stuff out of my head, but I also like learning. I found that the podcast also has allowed me to kind of talk to individuals and hear new perspectives, because you're in a landscape that you're not in every single day, Monday to Friday or whatever, with those individuals, right? Even our staff. We've had some of our ad team and our project team and such, on the podcast, and some of the stuff that they're saying, they never talk about in the office, or you just don't open the conversation up to get that deep or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. I've enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's been really interesting.
I think for me, one of the biggest things has been like just the tech and just the production aspect of the podcast. I mean, like I said earlier, like microphones and stuff like that I know about, but it's also things like, diving in deep into, like not so much like the social media aspect. I mean, we're a marketing agency. We do that, but it's more about like building some of these skills and refining those skills over time so that things are quicker, whether it be the sessions that you have with the team. Like it's not just Jordan and I, we have people on our team here. Like we have LaRue, big shout out to LaRue, who does all of our post editing. We've had graphics people, freelancers to do a whole bunch of stuff for us. Mainly just because that's their niche. We got Leanne, who's in charge of our social for the Challngtunity podcast. Big shout out to Leanne. So a lot of our social direction and all that kind of stuff. So just learning all these aspects over and over and over again from tip to toe has been kind of one of the biggest things that I didn't know I was going to experience when I first came in. How about you?
Well, I think I've had to adapt. Yeah. And it's mostly been, I think, on the personality side of just getting over the fact that I got to deal with, got a camera pointed in my face and doing things that I'm not usually prone to doing. But, as long as I pretend that everybody's just inside that little camera screen, the little lens, it doesn't bother me anymore as far as that's concerned. I'm just not fully comfortable yet, but I'm getting better at that, I think.
You're learning. I mean, what did you do 5 seconds before we hit record? You're fluffing your beard. You're making sure your beard's, you got it, Yeah. The Jordan Woolf fan base there has to, the beard, it has to be on point. So yeah, there's all these things that we didn't know. And I'm sure if you're listening to this, you're going, okay, yeah, I went through some of that as well with my podcast, or, I'm entering into that world, and thanks, I never would have thought of that either. But I think it makes sense for us to maybe quantify this a little bit and actually provide some tips, we'll, call them topics. Jordan,
prepared for our amateur list of things to kind of keep in mind.
That's right. Key slide deck here. No, I just think it's important. I think instead of us just talking just for half an hour or whatever, let's actually give you guys some stuff to take home. So I think, what do we have? We have 5 of them that we felt was really, really these essential tips that you should take away. Given that we're 6, 7, 8 months into podcast recording. So Jordan, why don't you give us the first one?
Well, I think, when you're trying to plan out any particular podcast, you should have, something to provide, something to focus on. We, in the marketing world, we like to call that the concept of why, as well as what, but why tends to be more important first. Like, why are you even doing this? Who is it for? What is it in the end? All these, WH questions, but why is the first one to start with? If you don't have a good why, then you're probably not worthwhile getting anything done in the podcast world until you do. So having that as a starting point is a big kind of, area of focus. At the same time, you don't want to use it as an excuse not to learn or adapt. So just because you had a good idea, or you had a really concrete idea of what you were trying to accomplish, or what it was supposed to do, or why you were supposed to be there, if the real world starts telling you something different, then listen and ideally adapt if it's in alignment with where you want to go.
Yeah, the why is important. Obviously, if there's a reason behind doing a podcast, there clearly is a what. There should be something to say, but there should also be a who. Who is that audience? For us, it's marketing professionals and business leaders. That's our world. We speak to those people every single day, sometimes too much, and our brains toast by the end of the day. But the reality is there's a lot of value that those individuals have got from us and our team, just our whole agency over the years. And we want to kind of get that out to the world, hopefully being able to help people. That's the heart behind the podcast.
And like you kind of indicated, like the thing that really pushed us over the edge to do this, even though it was kind of somewhat of an idea in the background, the thing that said like, nope, we got to do this, is when enough people kind of said, people aren't talking like this. People aren't saying the things you're saying. We need those things out there. So, that's our why in a lot of ways, is to make sure that there is a world where these ideas are communicated. And in our case, it's it's a combination of things that are going to be valuable for business people and marketing professionals that, in our case, leans a little bit towards where agencies focused, maybe some process focus, engineering type focus, disciplines in marketing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the next one on the list, being very rigid here, is everybody knows that you have to record a podcast. There's an actual recording process that goes. Jordan, for example, has to powder before we do a recording so that on YouTube he doesn't have a shiny face. Very important. So the actual recording is one thing. You come into it knowing that there's pre-work that has to be done. But the tip is to expect the post to be as much work as the pre and the actual recording itself. So as much as you have these raw files, which, little side rant here, depending on your recording software, will record exactly what you're seeing right now, where you have all the branding and everything, right? And there's other softwares out there that'll spit out raw files as well. So you'll have different recordings, both video and audio, of all the different participants, which is very important. That's a tip, by the way, because you can now adjust those levels in post. But the post is important because you can now adjust lighting, you can adjust any blemishes, you can cut out any segments of the video or the recording that maybe there was a glitch, maybe the internet came out, whatever the case might be. So that the post, and expecting the post to take probably, I'd say about 50% of the time, which is half the amount of time of the entire amount of work that you have to put into to just polish off an episode.
Yeah, and like you've said, we've chosen particular platforms that make some of that a little bit easier on the back end, like having the video tools that have all the built-in graphics, et cetera, does cut down on the back post-processing, but it increases the pre-processing to some degree. We have to create graphics and templates and things that work for different scenarios. So it's some limitations on one side, trade-offs on the other, but that's a balance you'll have to figure out podcast to podcast, tool to tool, purpose to purpose.
Well, and why don't we jump into that third one, which is exactly that. It's talking a bit about, the less editing, the more authentic it feels, things like that, right? Which we talked about earlier. Just to give you the lay of the land on some of the stuff we do, we want to have some consistency when it comes to our audio, right? So we use Shure SM7B mics, both Jordan and I do. That makes day one, when we come in, we know we have the same kind of tone. We have all the same type of levels coming into it, in addition to our preamps and all that are all the same. We utilize Ecamm. This is not a plug for Ecamm, but it's been great for us. We can go in and I can trigger all of our animations. And originally, when we started using Ecamm, you didn't have the ability to have separate audio and video files. But what we loved about it is that all the branding, the themes, the skins, all that kind of stuff, we could preload. So where I'm going with this is that when we do a recording, if we do it in one take, which, little secret sauce, we actually do most of the time, it's done. It's ready to go. It makes it so that your post is a lot less time. I talked about it being 50%, but it can be a lot more than that depending on how much work you do up front. We also use a Stream Deck, which is like, I could show it to you, but I don't have the reach here, but it's, all these buttons. So I can trigger things like, boom, the Jordan Woolf animation, right? I can trigger these things at a moment's notice. I can adjust the actual, scenes that we're actually viewing, right? So all these scenes, all the things that are changing, we're doing live a lot of the time. So I guess less editing, right? The more you can go swimming or kayaking or something in the evenings. I don't know. Your call.
Yeah.
Your call.
Yeah, and we got some pointless little things too that do have occasional uses, like sound effect boards and all that kind of stuff. But they're not always the best tool in the right place, or you can use them in the wrong time and mess things up. So having live control is great, but it also has its downsides as well. So it depends on your comfort level, your processes, which tools will be right. All you really need in the end is like a camera and a microphone to some degree. Some earbuds though are huge, especially for guests. Yeah. That's probably the most common overlooked thing as far as tools are concerned.
Well, and everybody's got different equipment, right? We've had guests that the audio has just been poor and there's just nothing we can do about that. I mean, aside from kicking them out of their offices wherever they may be located and telling them to go buy something. I mean, you deal with what you can, and you can adjust stuff in post. But mics and some kind of in-ear, very, very, very important. Very important.
Speaking of guests, I know that that's something we have some insights on. You tend to arrange things on that side, so this is more of a question for you as far as what are some of the tips related to guests?
Yeah, I guess the tip there is just equip your guests the best you absolutely can, and we've just learned, trial by fire over all these episodes that sometimes you have guests, like we have guests like Parneet or Jason, who they have all the equipment. They came in and they already did their levels and they're ready to go. They're in, rooms with sound dampening and stuff like that. And then you have other guests, I don't know, like Colleen, who is in a super echoey office with a headset from Walmart, and I don't even know if she had a mic, and you do the best that you can. But as you go through those trials, you end up creating a checklist. You start creating a list of all the things that can help, tee up a guest. So that list has things like, check out some of the podcasts before. We always schedule a meeting with our guests, not too far in advance, but not obviously right before, to run through the agenda. We always ask our guests to send in topics that they would like to cover. I mean, it's never there to plug their business or anything like that. It's usually to talk about them in their professional setting. We'll do things like giving them examples of things that you should prepare for right before. Go get water. Go to the washroom. Make sure your pets and your family are somewhere else. Be in a room that's quiet. But these are all points that are in there and might seem like common sense, but to somebody who's never come in, they might be a genius in their world, but they don't know anything about podcasting. They might not understand the consequences of those things while recording. So I think, Jordan, I don't know if we haven't talked about this, but I think it might be a good idea for us to put the example checklist on our website. Just you guys can have it for free. It's not going to be perfect, be very clear, but it's where we're at today. It'll always evolve. That's the part of doing this. You always learn and you adapt. So,
yeah, no, I know we've kind of mentioned mostly like these pretty practical tips about tools and planning and having purpose. But another thing is like inspiration can go a long way. So if you can learn from those around you, kind of saves you a lot of effort. So as one pro tip, I know both Chris and I had very different references coming into this podcast. Like,
yes,
listen to different things, watch different things, had two different ideas about things that were inspiration. But in the end, we managed, I think, to take little elements of each one and kind of bring them together to become our own thing. And, I remember looking at Sam Harris's Making Sense podcast, not because, we're not doing these kind of philosophical conversations with like neuroscientists or different figures, but we do have a parallel where we will have guests on, and I really liked the way that he handled kind of the preamble with them, making sure that they were prepped, like we were just talking about, some inspiration from there, as well as giving them control to be like, hey, if you say something stupid that you don't want on there, it's your prerogative. You're going to have an opportunity to kind of tell us, and we'll be able to make those edits if necessary. Now, we haven't had to do that yet, but we like that ability to make those kind of statements and keep it kind of casual. So they feel free to share their ideas, and also know that they're not going to be hung up to dry if they say something in the passion of the moment that didn't quite land, or an idea that didn't quite think through in the most thorough sense. It's a weird medium for that sense. And another one that I really liked was the All In podcast with Chamath Palihapitiya and David Sachs and David Freeberg. That one's pretty popular as a business and kind of finance, and they're all in the tech and startup world, so that's a lot of fun. That makes that podcast really interesting to me. But I do like how casual that is, and that's something I strive for in kind of our ongoing evolution of this program. But understandably, it's one of those things I'm struggling with personally at the moment, is making it more calm and relaxed.
Well, and I think you bring up a lot of valid points. Really what you're saying there is that if you're putting on a podcast, you might as well tee up a podcast that's successful And the way to know if it's going to be successful is by learning from those that are, right? And you're right. We do listen to very different podcasts. I listen to a lot of like faith-based stuff and actually a lot of sports stuff. Like the New Heights podcast is a huge thing in the world right now. And I love it. Speaking of which, they changed their shirts. I was going to buy a shirt and it's gone. New Heights podcasts, get your shirts back. But that all being said, it's not just about watching the podcast and seeing, how do they banter or what is the visuals, like how do they structure that? It's also things like how do they distribute their social media, right? Like their snippets, their clips, when they bring guests on, do they change their setting? Do they go to them? Do they do like, just look at how they're doing things from a production perspective and a marketing perspective and just take notes and then check out other podcasts and just keep doing that. And if you're anything like Jordan and I, we're very similar people, but radically different as well. It somehow works. My mom doesn't understand how we're in business together, but then sometimes she's like, oh yeah, it makes total sense. So, my mom's a big fan of the podcast.
Yeah. Let me think. I think we did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tips. Yeah. We got through them all.
5 tips.
So 5 fingers, 5 tips. Awesome. Well, I know we covered quite a bit today, and it's kind of a weird episode. It's not a guest episode. It's not a marketing related episode like we normally would have, but at the same time, it's something that, we're adding value hopefully to somebody somewhere who's going through the same trials and tribulations or thinking about doing this themselves. Again, we want to add value in this podcast as one of our goals, and trying a new episode for a new idea is definitely worth the effort.
Yeah, and obviously, if you're gaining any kind of insight or any value, share. Tell people about the podcast. Comment on social. Like, share, comment, all those things. But we also are not just on the platform that you're listening to us on. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Google, so on and so forth, as well as YouTube. So if you're listening, you get to see our faces if you go to our YouTube channel, as well as, like we talked about a moment ago, we're going to have some resource that we're going to start adding as a knowledge base on the Challngtunity podcast. So make sure to check that out. Subscribe wherever you can subscribe. We really do appreciate you. We don't just do this because, I don't know, Jordan, we don't do it because we want people to really see us. We do this because we enjoy it. We want to help people. So Thanks for joining us.
Get the ideas out.
That's right. And we'll see you in a couple weeks' time. Cheers.